tell us how the cinema industry started in Sudan?
السينما المتجولة بدأت في السودان سنة 1947 وبفتكر هي كانت خبرة في جنوب أفريقيا وفي يعني كينيا بالذات، وكانوا الإنجليز طبعا بيحكموا تلك المنطقة، وشعروا بأنه السودان بلد واسع جدا والطرق اللي فيه ما كويسة والسكان موزعين يعني سكترت، وكانوا محتاجين لنوع من التوعية يعني في الإرشاد الزراعي، في المعلومات الصحية، وبعدين يعني الحاجات اللي بتساعدهم كانت أغراضها تعليمية أكثر. فشافوا الفكرة دي كانت موجودة في جنوب أفريقيا وفي كينيا، فاتصلوا على الحكم الثنائي. السودان ده طبعا كان محكوم ب يعني دولتين بيسموه دومينيون رول، اللي هو الحكم الإنجليزي والحكم البريطاني، لكن كان الإنجليز أكثر سطوة وظهور يعني. فهم اللي عملوا الاتصالات دي، فأخذنا التجربة بتاعتهم فورونا وجابوا خبراء للسودان، والخبراء ديل بدأوا في يعني إنشاء السينما المتجولة في السودان لمقابلة احتياجات المواطنين.
Was cinema used for propaganda by the British?
والله عشان ننصف الحكم الثنائي ما كانوا هم قصدهم من السينما المتجولة دي إنها تعمل لهم بروباغندا للحكومة الاستعمار، لكن كان الغرض بتاعها يعني غرض تعليمي وإرشادي للشعب للأسباب اللي أنا ذكرتها قبل شوية: طبيعة السكان، نسبة التعليم، الاحتياج بتاع المزارعين والناس العاديين للاستفادة منها في الزراعة، التعليم، الأشياء كثيرة جدا كانت محتاجة لها الحكومة عشان ترفع من مستوى الناس في المعرفة.
Was cinema used for propaganda by the resistance and liberation movements in Sudan prior to 1956?
الحقيقة من الريزيستنس موفمنت في الوقت ذاك ما كانت ظاهرة وكانت في بداياتها، ثم ان الريزيستنس موفمنت ذاتها ما عندها وسائط او سينما متجولة عشان تستخدمها. حتى الكفاح المسلح او الكفاح الوطني ما كان موجود كثير، وما كان عندهم الوسائل دي، يعني كانت يا دوبك عندهم الصحف وعندهم المنابر الشعبية والأندية فكانوا بيستخدموها، لكن دي كانت تستخدمها الحكومة.
Was cinema used as propaganda by the ruling political parties after independence?
والله برضو ما كان بيستخدموها، لأنه أولا هي المالك للسينما المتجولة حكومة الحكم الثنائي، ثم من بعد ذلك حتى بعد الاستقلال كانت تملكها الحكومة اللي هي المنتخبة، أو الحكومات اللي جات بعد الحكومات المنتخبة الحكومات العسكرية. يعني طوال هذه الفترة لحد الليلة دي ما في حزب سياسي ولا في تكتل سياسي عنده سينما متجولة عشان يستخدمها سياسيا، ولا عنده، يعني كانت دائما الحكومة هي اللي بتستخدم، إذا كانت حكومة حزبية ولا حكومة عسكرية هي اللي كانت تستخدم السينما المتجولة، وما كان استخدام واسع يعني.
What kind of movies were shown on the permanent cinemas versus the mobile cinemas?
البيرمننت سينما دي سينما بيسموها سينما تجارية، ودي تاريخها يعني من بدري جدا. يعني الناس عملوا دور سينما زي شركة ليكوس وزي قديس في أم درمان، وبعدين يعني لما نجحت حكاية السينمات كانت تستخدم أفلام روائية، يعني الأفلام وبالذات يعني الأفلام المصرية والأفلام اللي بتنتجها هوليوود واللي هي معها ترجمة، ودي كانت سينمات تجارية ومحدودة جدا وفي مناطق محدودة. بدأت في الخرطوم، بدأت في درمان، ثم بعد ذلك جاءت شركة السينما الوطنية اللي هي بتاعت مواطنين عندهم أسهم وبحبوا ينافسوا القديس وينافسوا شركة ليكوس، فأنشأوا سينمات. والسينمات طبعا ما كانت موجودة في كل أنحاء السودان، كانت موجودة في الخرطوم والخرطوم بحري ومدرمان اللي بيسموها العاصمة المثلثة، وكانت في الأبيض، كانت في مدني، كانت في بور سودان، كانت في عطبر، المدن الكبيرة دي. وبعدين بدوا الناس يعني بعد كده ينشئوا برضو في المحلات ذات الكثافة السكانية، مثلا عملوا سينما في الحصاحيصة وهكذا.
And the movies in the mobile cinemas.
أما الموبايل سينما فكانت بتعرض اثنين. الموبايل سينما دي بتعرض الأفلام التعليمية والأفلام الإرشادية زي ما أنا ذكرتها، ودي بتنتجها وحدة الإنتاج السينمائي. دي برضو وحدة تانية نشأت قريبة من السينما المتجولة في وقت واحد. فالإنتاج السينمائي ده بينتج أفلام سودانية لذلك الغرض، يعني إرشاد الناس وتعليم الناس وكده. لكن هي نفسها كانت بتأجر أفلام برضو روائية، لأنه لما تمشي عشان تعرض الأفلام التعليمية دي للناس كانت بتحتاج يعني توري الناس الفترة اللي بيقعدوا فيها، وقبل ما يجي العرض بتعرض لهم أفلام تجارية عن الأفلام الروائية العادية دي، فيها نوع من المتعة للناس قبل ما يجي العرض بتاع المقصود اللي هو التعليمي أو الإرشادي.
How did cinemas function as a social gathering space, and what kind of interactions happened around them?
ده سؤال واسع. يعني في السينمات لحد ما بدأت في السودان هي تجارية، أولا كانت يعني مفتوحة open، ما كانت سينمات يعني مبنية وزي السينمات المعهودة في العالم. كانت زي السمر سينماس، يعني في أوروبا وفي أمريكا في سينمات عادية دي اللي هي معروشة والناس بيخشوا جوا وبيشوفوا الفيلم، وفي سينمات في الصيف فقط بيمشوا لها الناس بعرباتهم مفتوحة وبيشوفوا الأفلام. إحنا في السودان ما كانت عندنا إلا السينمات المكشوفة دي، ما في سينما متغطية يعني مبنية. ولذلك السينمات ده النمط بتاعها. ما حصل عندنا سينما مغطاة إلا لما بنينا قاعة الصداقة في الخرطوم، ودي عملتها حكومة مايو، وكان من ضمن مفردات أو الحاجات الموجودة في قاعة الصداقة قاعة للسينما. والأول مرة نجيب قاعة مغطية وفيها تكييف وفيها إضاءة وفيها كراسي مريحة وفيها كل متطلبات السينما العالمية يعني.
Did the presence of cinema lead to an emerging cinema industry?
والله أبدا. الناس طبعا في السودان كانت في محاولات ما بتسميها اندستري. يعني الرشيد ده عمل يعني الأول مرة في عطبرة، عملوا محاولات بدائية يعني ما كانت فيها إمكانيات الصناعة للسينما، ولا كانت عنده الإمكانيات اللي هو يعمل استوديو عشان ينتج منه، لكن اجتهد. فأظن عندنا 3 أو 4 أفلام سودانية روائية عرضت في السينما وطويلة، لكن ما استمرت كصناعة. ولحد اليوم مثلا في السودان ما بتقدر تقولي في صناعة سينمائية.
What relationships existed between filmmakers and architects?
والله ما في. هو طبعا لأنه ما في فيلم ميكر زي ما قلت لك بالمعنى المفهوم في العالم هذا. يعني ما في صناعة، ما في شركات، ما في مؤسسات سينمائية، ما في استثمارات في السينما، ما في استوديوهات منتشرة في المناطق المختلفة في أنحاء البلد يعني. فما الجودة ما عندنا يعني حكاية صناعة سينما عشان الناس ينفقوا فيها أموال ويجيبوا فيها معدات ويعملوا شركات. وبعدين في الجانب الثاني اللي هو الممثلين والكتاب والمنتجين إلى آخر هذه التصنيفات الموجودة في صناعة السينما. ما عندنا المرحلة دي، وده في أغلب دول العالم الثالث، يعني ما عدا مثلا الهند. يعني الهند طبعا أكثر بلد منتج للأفلام الروائية في وقت من الأوقات، حسب الدراسات اللي إحنا اشتركنا فيها لما الناس بدوا يعملوا دراسة للسينما ودراسة للتلفزيون إلى آخر هذه الأشياء.
Do you have pictures or the exact locations where the mobile cinema was located on Zubair Basha Road?
أيوة، المعالم انتهت دلوقتي. هي بيت كان مستأجر، بيت ما يعني بيت عادي، وجابوا فيه السينما المتجولة ومؤجر يعني. لكن حتى الآن السينما المتجولة بعد ما مشت لقدام والحكم الوطني جاء وحصل تطور في وزارة الإعلام وجات المعونة الأمريكية. يعني الأمريكان حقق لهم الفضل في إنهم بنوا لنا يعني سينما أو جزء من المبنى بتاع الإعلام في الأم درمان قسم للسينما المتجولة. يعني فيه العربات وفيه المعدات وفيه المكتبة الرئيسية وفيه العمال اللي بيسوقوا العربات وفيه العمال اللي برضه بيساعدوا بإنه بيوجهوا الناس بالنظام الساوند سيستم قبل ما يبقى العرض في القرى وفي المناطق النائية البعيدة. لأنه السينما المتجولة طبعا شغلها خارج الخرطوم، يعني ما كانت معمولة أو موجهة للعواصم، إنما موجهة للمناطق البعيدة اللي هي صعب إنه الناس يصلوها.
Can you give us some names of people or organizations of those who contributed in developing the mobile cinema from South Africa and Kenya?
والله لا أذكر، لأنه ما في الوثائق اللي أنا شفتها ما بتذكر أسماء. لكن في اسمين من الإنجليز اللي جونا من جنوب، من الأوروبيين البيض اللي اتفرقوا يعني وأصبحوا موجودين في البلاد دي، هم اللي أسسوا السينما المتجولة يعني. بعدين دربوا عندنا كوادر عظيمة جدا. يعني السودان دلوقتي بقى من أحسن الدول في العالم اللي عندها تجربة متميزة في يعني السينما المتجولة، لأنه دي لما جونا وضعوا تصميم للعربات وأشكالها ودربوا الناس وعلموا السودانيين. فبعد ما راحوا بقت السينما المتجولة صناعة سودانية حقيقية يعني، لكن مملوكة للدولة، والدولة بالذات أقرب وزارة لإنها تكون مالكة للسينما المتجولة وهي وزارة الإعلام بتسمياتها المختلفة.
What was the design for the mobile cinema and what kind of equipment were used?
تعرف دي أهم حاجة في الحكاية بتاعت قضية السينما المتجولة. السينما المتجولة دي بالمناسبة فيها مفردات كثيرة جدا. فيها العربية، هي متجولة لأنه مبنية كل حاجاتها في عربية. العربية دي لازم يكون تصميمها تكون عربية رقد يعني قوية، وفيها يعني زي ما بقولوا ما بتذكر الحاجات اللي بتقاوم الطرق الوعرة لأنها حاملة معدات وكده، ولذلك لما يصنعوها فيها يايات أكتر من الطائرة العادية. بعدين السينما المتجولة جواها هي بتكون عربية مبنية بطريقة معينة، عربية زي اللاند روفر من ورا مغطية، فيها جنريتر عشان الكهرباء، فيها بروجيكتور عشان يعرض الأفلام، فيها شاشات ملوية يعني بتتخطى ورا، فيها نظام ميكروفونات ولاود سبيكرز كبيرة جدا عشان يطلعوها للناس، يحصل فيه الخطاب يعني مع الناس قبل العرض. فيها يعني أشياء كثيرة جدا لما تطلعيها من العربية وبعدين الناس يوزعوها، وأسلاك كثيرة جدا عشان يربطوا الميكروفونات، وميكروفونات بشكل معين أو عشان تغطي مساحة واسعة جدا بيكونوا فيها الناس بيسمعوا كلام الزول اللي بيتكلم معاهم، بيسمعوا كلام الزول اللي جاي يعمل لهم محاضرة، بيسمعوا كلام الناس اللي دارين يسألوا عشان الباقي يسمعوا. فيها برضو نظام للصوت للأغاني، لأنه بيبثوا أغاني للمواطنين في انتظار مشاهدة الفيلم عشان ما يملوا. كان بيعرضوا لهم بيسمعوا أغاني بتاعت الفنانين، بعدين بيشوفوا الأفلام الروائية عشان المتعة، حتى يجي الفيلم المقصود بالسينما المتجولة هو الفيلم التعليمي أو الفيلم الإرشادي اللي هو بيعلم الناس وبيدي الناس فرصة عشان يسألوا ويتعرفوا على ظروفهم وكده. يعني لو في أوبئة، لو في ملاريا، لو في أي حاجة زي دي بينبهوا الناس. بعدين موضوع الموية، بعدين موضوع كل الحشرات، مكافحتها، أشياء كثيرة جدا تعليمية.
Thank you, Mr. Shamo, for this interview.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So I'll be presenting the German Pavilion. It's a convergence of diplomacy and film narrative. Before we delve into political background, I would like to talk a little bit about the building itself. We can go to the next slide. So the building was constructed by the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, and it was partially dismantled in 1961. The exhibition ran from November 25th to December 12th in 1961. And it was designed by George Lipsmeyer, who was a German designer. The design brief required the exhibition to be a lightweight structure, in addition to the financial logic that often commanded the trade fair buildings. The exhibition needed to be constructed rapidly. So like as you can see, it was constructed with the Miro structure, with a completely steel structure in a context that mainly use like brick for construction. The originally temporary exhibition space, the pavilion, it was meant to be a temporary space. It was partially dismantled, and then the rest like it's now it remains a tangible remnant of Cold War diplomacy. Within the presentation, we'll shed light on the intersection between politics, culture, architecture in a post-colonial and Cold War context. I've created a small timeline because a lot was going on in the world at that time. So the defeat of Germany in the Second World War in 1949, it has led to the division of Germany into the FRG, which West Germany, and the GDR, which East Germany, which subsequently set a stage for competition seeking international recognition. Before the announcement of Germany's division, the Northwestern German Trade Fair Organization, it's now the NOIA, or the Association of the German Trade Fair Industry. Was initiated by British occupying forces at that time in 1947 to counterpart the pre-war role of the well-established Leipzig Trade Fair. The trade fairs have played an important role in the politics of the German world, which is as you can see. And then the GDR, sorry, the GDR, as like everyone was seeking international recognition, both Germany's, the GDR had a trade agreement with Germany. The GDR had a trade agreement with Egypt, which it was a diplomatic tool to gain, as I said, the international diplomacy. It's noted that the trade fairs at that time was a worthwhile opportunity for practicing architects. The pavilion demonstrates the influence of foreign architects on the African architectural scene. Sudan having gained independence in 1956, it was a critical site for this competition, and it was being referred to as a young nation that recently decolonized. In 1955, only a few days before the Sudanese National Assembly voted for their independence from the British Egyptian colony, the Holstein Doctrine, which is a foreign policy principle of the Federal Republic of Germany, it was announced, sought to isolate the GDR from the international community. It stated that the Federal Republic would not establish or maintain diplomatic relation with any state that recognized a German democratic republic. This policy directly influenced the political interactions in Africa, including Sudan. Hindered by the doctrine, Sudan quasi-diplomatic status with the West, East Germany has struggled to form international diplomatic relations with Africa and the whole world. They had efforts to open a liaison office in Sudan, while the British Foreign Office judged that they couldn't intervene in Khartoum. Right after the doctrine was announced, the ambassador Heinrich Diaz threatened Sudanese officials that the Western FRG would cut all relations if the GDR liaison office was granted. This tested Sudan's strategy by weakening Eastern international legitimacy and preventing its diplomatic recognition. Conversely, the FRG established a diplomatic liaison office in 1953, which later became a legation and upgraded to an embassy in 1959. Okay, so we can see, can we go back to the last slide? Okay, so we still there was at that time the inner German post-war relations were escalating to win the rivalry of both domestic and international legitimacy. It was evident when in 1953 the FRG hoped to exhibit the wares in Cairo, but that exhibition didn't occur. It's important to note that the international, like the back and forth rivalry, it was happening simultaneously in Cairo and in Khartoum. The FRG exhibited the first exhibition, it was in Cairo in 1957. At that time, at the fair, one Sudanese delegate expressed an interest in hosting an exhibition in Sudan, and he was given a promise. This was just 1 year following the Sudan independence. There was a coup d'etat attempted, orchestrated by the Communist Party. At that time, the East Germans, on their part, saw it's an opportunity for East Germans to propose to the Sudanese authorities to organize an industry exhibition in Khartoum. But the Sudanese government has declined the offer. It was stated in a brief address to the Foreign Federal Office in Bonn that the request was denied due to Sudan's strong relation with the USA and Great Britain, indicating that Sudan hasn't fully achieved its independence yet. And both FRG and right now, like in 1957, both the FRG and the GTR has showed interest in staging an exhibition in Khartoum. Okay. In addition to the trade fairs, the back and forth interaction, it was extended to a broadcast media. Both German states utilized the film as tool for Cold War diplomacy, continuing to establish a legitimacy within recently decolonized nations, much like The counterpart we saw in the trade fairs, like the both organization, the Leipzig Trade Fair and the Dusseldorf Messe. Then here in the GDR had a newsreel called the Augenzeuge, which translates to the eyewitness, and the West Germany Neue Deutsche Wochenschau, which translates to the news stories. This continued the rivalry. These newsreels portrayed the image of decolonized nations, as evidenced by Sudan's feature in 1956, Blinkpunkt Africa, Spotlight Africa, with the GDR delegation in Khartoum. The films were extended to the alliances. To the alliances with the British Pathé, producing a short documentary on the independence. The short documentary, can we play it's a 15 minutes or 15 seconds. It's okay. So within the documentary, they indicate Sudan like the world has
constantly fighting with people that are dramatic, that are troublemakers. We don't aspire to be people like that. So
the Sudan, for 58 years under the joint rule of Britain and Egypt, becomes an independent republic. The Proclamation of Independence is read from the balcony of the House of Representatives in Khartoum, and the new flag is hoisted. Blue for the Nile, yellow for the desert, green for agriculture. A five-man Supreme Commission will act for the time being as head of state. A joint session of the Senate and the House of Representatives hears the new republic proclaimed. Premier El Azari thanks Britain and Egypt for giving his country freedom to work out its own destiny.
So it was notable that at the beginning of the video they said like the world has gained a new nation. It was being referred to within the archives and within the archives and documents as Sudan as a young nation or a recently decolonized one, and that it was reflected also like that at that time the diplomatic dialogue took on film-based dimensions, and the PR films that were played were a crucial role in shaping the international perception. It had a documentary style centered on the political events like the inaugurations and diplomatic visits. As evident, we can see the German economic delegation that visited Sudan. President Aboud had welcomed then the delegation in the government palace, and the film was the visit was filmed and broadcasted. And here also within the German pavilion, we can see like the Krupp and the ambassador visiting, and the pictures were like around the delegation and the more like the business visits to Khartoum, and then they were broadcasted vice versa. Like it was broadcasted within the structure, and it was broadcasted in Germany itself. The FRG produced two films in 1961 with guests in Bonn and Koblenzer Street, which was a day-to-day office at the Foreign Office. We can go to the next. We can see this is part of the German the German business delegation that was traveled to the Sudanese capital. As the Cold War tension escalated in 1961, the German Democratic Republic, after producing those two films, and the construction of the start of the construction of the Berlin Wall on the August 13th. This was just a few months before the German Industrial Pavilion in Khartoum, which was after the coup d'etat by President Aboud. So we can see at that time we had the timeline had many events between happening in Germany and the Cold War in Germany and in Khartoum, as I don't want to say recently decolonized, but yes, recently decolonized, gaining independence. Now we see, in addition to promoting the German craftsmanship and Germany's modernity through scientific rationality and industrialization, the cultural diplomacy played a significant role, and the two Germanies competed in the presence of culture, politics, and products. The competition was even extended to the Germanness of the state. They both showcased the Germany's traditions. For example, the GDR in Egypt, in Cairo, they hosted classical German concerts, dance show, and folk songs. And on the ground, in Khartoum, they had an open-air cinema and a restaurant, on-ground restaurant, that served traditional sausage. The FRG almost had the same attraction with activities in Khartoum in 1961. The on-ground restaurant, it was particularly well received, as shown in the image. It was said that even the waitresses were brought from Germany as a special features, and original Bavarian orchestra that played the same songs every evening. It was part of the cultural program. We see this picture was taken in August 9, 2022. It was the original restaurant. It was an open air, and the brick was recently added for adaptation and closure. The German Pavilion in Khartoum is a tangible in Khartoum of intersection of politics, culture, and architecture during the Cold War. It served as a platform for diplomatic and cultural exchange. It embodies the FRG's effort to convey a modern, progressive image in a non-aligned post-colonial context. Its legacy as a vocational center highlights the impact of Cold War in Sudan dynamics. The Cold War dynamics on Sudan's built environment. This last picture I included the German Pavilion right now, or in 2022 when I last visited. It was the vocational training center in Khartoum, and it was still called the Germany, like the German vocational training center. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Suha and Dokumama Sudan, for the invitation. I'm honored to be able to present here my thoughts on post-war cultural facilities in Slovakia. And please excuse me for this pre-recorded presentation. On 20th January 2022, development company Imacap, owner of the former House of Trade Unions in Bratislava, started demolition of the main building with a congress hall, theater, cinema, and other social spaces. This iconoclastic act took place even though the building was a landmark of the city, and at the same time the proposal for its listing as National Cultural Monument was assessed by the Slovak Monuments Board. However, the truth is that the Monuments Board was already dealing with the initiative submitted by the Slovak Dokumu Working Party in April 2019 for the third year. The unsuccessful efforts for monument protection and the destruction of this important part of the architectural heritage illustrate in a concentrated form several problems of the protection of late modernism architecture in Slovakia, such as the inability to accept this architecture as a fully fledged part of the historical heritage on the part of the conservation community, the limited possibility or ability of the public administration, including the conservation authorities, to face the pressure of the property owners, but especially the general attitude of the elites in relation to the heritage of the welfare state. These problems are fully manifested in the buildings for culture, which the former regime implemented in large numbers all over Slovakia. The houses of culture as generators of socialist social life and instruments for the promotion of official culture had a special status and special attention was paid to their construction. This meant situating such buildings in prominent places in the centers of settlements, increased demands on their architectural form, and higher investment in costs. The circumstances that favored such investments at the time of their creation often turned into a handicap after the change of the regime in 1989. The authoritarian regime of socialist Czechoslovakia invested heavily in the construction of facilities for the dissemination of official culture and education. In the second half of the 20th century, buildings for public cultural, social, and educational events grew up in every major settlement as well as in small villages. Despite the fact that they were a tool for the promotion of the regime's ideology, cultural centers cannot be denied their contribution to the dissemination of culture and the development of civil society in the broadest sense of the word. Each cultural house contributed to the strengthening of the local community, the creation of new social connections, and thus to the cultivation of society and creation of its culture. In terms of construction, the most productive period was from the early 1960s to the mid-1980s, when the modernist idea of architecture and urbanism was fully implemented in Slovakia. In those years, the greatest and, from an architectural point of view, the most remarkable works were created. The first decade of this building period is characterized by the construction of urban cultural and social centers in abstract forms of the international style. They are a typical product of the reintegration of Czechoslovak architecture into the international architecture debate after the collapse of the neoclassical socialist realism. They were mostly designed as a part of new urban structures in the wider center, in immediate contact with the historic core of the cities. Let us mention the House of Culture, Družba in Levice, which you can see on a slide, or the House of the Culture of the Trade Union of the largest ironworks in Slovakia in the eastern center or important city of Slovakia, Košice. The later realizations of the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s, the plans for which were born in Slovakia in the atmosphere after the adoption of the law on the federal organization of the republic, were characterized by larger volumes, multifunctional typologies, and expressive monumental forms. They often entered the immediate centers of towns, where they contrasted with the original historic buildings. The most impressive works of this kind include the House of Culture in Trnava, which you can see on the image and which is situated in the right center of the protected historic area of the town. Or the community house in Dunajská Streda, which is a small town in the southern part of Slovakia, where the House of Culture is also situated in the center of the old town. And last but not least, the House of Culture in Spišská Nová Ves, in the very same case with the situation in the historic core of the city. Part of this group was also the largest of all Slovak cultural and social institutions, the House of Trade Unions and Technology in Bratislava, that was already mentioned in the beginning of my speech. It is important to note that the construction of public facilities for culture and education of the broad layers of the population was not the domain of the communist bloc. On the contrary, cultural and social facilities were an important part of the cultural policy of states on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. They were also given attention in Western European democracies, where hundreds of similar facilities were built as part of the welfare state policy. The largest houses of culture in Slovakia were built at a time when the redevelopment of the central parts of cities culminated. This trend, however, was not only the result of the ideological pressure of the communist regime and its disrespect for the bourgeois architectural heritage, it was largely promoted by experts, architects, and urban planners. They relied on the Athens Charter, which, in relation to monuments, was clearly in favor of cleansing the historic cores of cities of inferior structures. At the same time, they responded to the post-war notion of the urban center as the center of social life, the so-called heart of the city formulated by the participants in the 1951 CM in Hoddesdon. In practice, however, the situating of new civic amenities in the centers of settlements meant the disruption of the traditional urban fabric, often right in the historic core, often in the heart of a listed central urban area. At the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, when new town or zone plans were created and new principles for protected areas were defined, works of modernist architecture, even if they were cultural buildings, were in most cases evaluated as disturbing objects. This is still the case today in the relevant document. Even the splendid House of Art in Piešťany received legislative protection and declaration as a national cultural monument only in 2022, after the hard efforts of architects and architectural historians from Dokomumu Slovakia and local campaigners. In the first decades after the Velvet Revolution, dozens of cultural and social buildings were sold off in Slovakia. Most of the original owners of the houses of culture, be it the state, the city, or the trade unions, found themselves in financial difficulties after 1989 under the pressure of the market economy. This resulted in neglect of the maintenance of the buildings, their inappropriate use, or their sale to private entities. The change in the architectural and urban planning paradigm that began to manifest itself in Slovakia at the turn of the 1970s and 1980s also played a role in this process. The postmodernist notion of a return to traditional historical forms in city planning and to universally understandable means of architectural expression manifested itself in a radical rejection of modernism and its architectural and urban heritage. In the post-socialist countries, this denial of modernism culminated just after 1989, when it was combined with the rejection of authoritarianism and the global trend towards economic neoliberalism. It is thus clear that the desire to deal with the past, but also with global social trends, played a significant role in the discarding of property that carried negative connotations associated with communist ideology. That this was a most ill-considered and unfortunate move became apparent only a few years later. A lot of high-quality modern architecture, which could have formed the basis for the future development of individual cities, ended up in private hands. Let us mention the House of Culture in Banská Bystrica that you can see on an image and which you saw in its original condition on a previous image, which stands at the core of the new modernist city center and has been out of operation for a long time due to problematic ownership relationships. A similar case in the house is the House of Culture in Spišská Nová Ves, where the city owns about a third of the property, but the rest is in the hands of a few private owners, which prevents its holistic use and maintenance. In Trnava, the House of Culture is owned by a private entity which uses it in a contradiction to its original purpose and its special conditions, and has even planned its conversion into a collective parking plot. An exceptional example of the dynamics and consequences of the social and economic transformation taking place over the past 3 decades is Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. Among the first to fall into private hands was the area of the Park of Culture and Recreation, which lies on the bank of the river Danube. The sale of the land under its buildings was approved by the City Council in the year 2005. Years of non-transparent manipulation with land and buildings followed, accompanied by resistance from experts and active citizens. The whole process was finally concluded by the removal of all the original buildings of this cultural center in 2016. A similar fate befell the Bratislava open-air cinema. After the City Council approved its transfer into private hands, the building burned down, and the developer built a commercial housing development in its place. The complex of the former House of Trade Unions, Technology and Culture underwent the same process. In 2017, it was sold to private owners. They immediately started the process of gradual emptying and degradation, which culminated in the announcement of its demolition. Here you can see the interior of the Great Hall shortly before the complex was demolished. And demolition works started in January 2022 after 2 years of resistance from both the professionals and public. Even the nearly 11 dozen signatures on a petition to preserve the trade union house did not prevent its destruction. The disappearance of all these buildings was accompanied by the same arguments about obsolescence and inability to meet the current requirements. The well-known strategy of deliberate non-maintenance and controlled decay, followed by a proposal to demolish and build something else, was also applied to all of them. According to the American theorist of heritage preservation Jorge Otero Palos, there is another important reason behind their destruction, and this is the deregulation of the market economy. This, he argues, initially only made it impossible to practice this kind of socially engaged architecture, but now it is even removing the evidence that such architecture ever existed, and as this heritage falls victim to developer pressure to demolish it. The core of the problem then may be precisely the political will of today's elites to erase the architecture of modernism because of its ability to evoke memories of the legacy of the welfare state. For as Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, put it in his text Questions and Counter-Questions, and I quote, "If static experience is incorporated into the context of individual life histories, if it is utilized to illuminate a situation and throw light on individual life problems, if it communicates at all its impulses to a collective form of life, then art enters into a language game which is no longer that of aesthetic criticism, but belongs rather to everyday communicative practice." End of the quote. Therefore, it is extremely important to extend the field of protection beyond the technical restoration of buildings and to interpret the heritage of modern architecture in all its complexity. More than ever, therefore, our aim should be to explore and explain the value of modern concepts, including their social contribution. It is necessary to clarify their impact on local communities and to make them comprehensible to the public. It is precisely such a motivation that lie behind the preparation of a book that chronicles the origins, existence, and final death of the trade union house in Bratislava that you can see on the image, and also the latest book on the houses of culture in the former Czechoslovakia, which was published last year. We believe that it is not only an obituary, but also a tool that will help to bring the architecture of the modernism into the language game that is part of everyday communicative practice. Thank you for your kind attention.